In the winter of 1781, in the secluded hilltop town of Montevideo, Italy, a cluster of ochre-walled houses clinging to the rocky slopes as if fearful of tumbling into the olive grove valleys below, there stood the church of San Lorenzo, a structure both revered and regarded with quiet wariness, its thick medieval walls blotched with centuries of lichen, its massive arched doorway carved with worn saints whose eyes seemed eroded into blindness, its towering belfry, a narrow spine of stone that speared into the sky, topped with an ancient bronze bell said to have outlived every war, famine, and plague that had ever passed through the region. That bell, La Campana del Silenzio, had been cast in 1311 from metal said to contain not just bronze from the foundries of Bologna, but relic shards of a far older object, a pagan basin unearthed from the ruins of a temple long since vanished from the hilltop. And for centuries it had marked the rhythm of Montevideo days, the slow, sonorous tolls at dawn, the solemn calls to Mass, the mournful peals at funerals, until, without warning, its voice was gone. For weeks it had remained mute, though nothing visible had changed. The rope hung intact, the clapper swung free, and the sexton swore by all the saints that he had pulled the cord each morning as he had done for 34 years. Yet when he tugged with all his strength, the great bell swayed in its tower and struck. But no sound followed, only a faint shiver in the air that left his teeth aching. At first the townsfolk laughed uneasily, saying the winter frost had seized the bell's tongue. But as the days passed, the laughter thinned into murmurs. For in Montevideo, the older generation whispered of an old saying that when a church bell refused to ring it was not broken, but listening, and they spoke in lowered voices of years long before, when the bell had fallen silent and something had happened that no one wrote down. Father Gregorio, the parish priest who had served San Lorenzo for nearly 30 years, dismissed these tales as superstitious nonsense, insisting that the bell merely needed repair. Yet he was conspicuously reluctant to climb the tower's spiral steps to inspect it himself, claiming his knees were too weak for such heights, though the sexton had seen the priest scale those very steps to replace candles in the belfry niches only a year before. When pressed, Gregorio's eyes would dart toward the altar as though seeking shelter, and his hand would close tightly around his rosary until the knuckles whitened, as if the beads themselves offered protection. It was in this uneasy atmosphere that the morning of January 14th arrived, the feast of Saint Felix, when the people of Montevideo, 32 of its most devout among them, made their way up the frost-rimmed streets toward the church in the dim, watery light before sunrise, boots clattering on cobblestones rimmed in ice, breath curling in pale plumes before their faces. Inside, the nave was colder than the street, the stone floor leaching warmth from their souls, the damp smell of old incense clinging to the air, the flickering of tall beeswax candles casting restless shadows that crawled over the worn frescoes of saints and martyrs. Father Gregorio, robed in vestments of deep gold threaded with black, took his place at the altar, his voice low and steady as the Mass began, the organ's low, droning chords swelling beneath the vaulted ceiling, each note lingering in the cold air as if reluctant to fade. The liturgy proceeded in its familiar rhythm, readings, chants, responses, until, as the service neared its midpoint, a sound rose from the belfry above, a sound unlike any the congregation had ever heard, not the bright metallic peal of the bell they knew, Not even the flat thud of a lead strike, but a deep, resonant hum that seemed to swell from the very walls. A vibration that sank into their bones and pressed at their lungs. Heads turned upward instinctively, eyes wide in. The candlelight and the hum deepened, almost imperceptibly at first, until it felt as though the air itself were being drawn toward the bell tower, pulling with it the light, for the candles began to shrink in brightness, their flames ending as if caught in an unseen wind. A strange half-light spread through the nave, dim yet without clear source, muting the colors of the stained glass windows until the painted saints seemed darker, their eyes following the living below. The organist's fingers froze above the keys, a single bead of sweat sliding down his temple despite the cold, and still the hum thickened, not loud but inescapable, as though the sound existed inside the skull rather than outside. Then, without warning, it stopped, cut off as sharply as a blade through thread, and a silence fell so profound that it seemed to crush even the memory of sound. A silence in which the rustle of a sleeve, the creak of a pew, even the beating of one's own heart felt swallowed whole. Some would later say the air in that instant felt heavier, denser, as if they had been lowered into deep water, and there was an acrid tang on the tongue like scorched iron, though no soak or flame was anywhere in sight. Father Gregorio opened his mouth to speak, to continue the Mass or perhaps to calm his flock, but no words emerged. His lips moved, yet his voice was consumed before it could echo, devoured by that impossible quiet. And then it happened. In the front half of the church, where the 32 most devout sat, there was a flicker, not of light, but of presence, and in the span of a blink they were gone. Not one stood, not one cried out, not one moved toward the door. They simply were, and then were not, leaving behind shawls, hats, gloves, prayer books lying open to psalms, and in one case a rosary still swinging gently from the hand that had held it only moments before. For a heartbeat, the rest of the congregation sat frozen, their minds struggling to understand what their eyes saw, and then panic shattered the stillness. Mothers shrieking, men stumbling over benches in their rush into the doors, only to find them unmoving. The great iron hinges locked as if sealed from without. Someone bolted for the side door to the sacristy, same result, while above them the belfry remained utterly still, the bell unmoving, yet a faint metallic ring, like the fading note of a goblet struck by a wet finger, lingered in their skulls. The doors finally gave way after a frantic assault, spilling the survivors into the pale daylight, where the square outside lay empty and cold. Runners were sent to comb the streets, the surrounding fields, the nearby woods. But no trace of the 32 was found. No footprints in the frost. No scattered belongings beyond those left in the pews. No sign that they had ever crossed the threshold. The crypt beneath the church was searched by torchlight, its stone coffins and shadowed niches revealing nothing but the slow drip of winter moisture. As hours passed, word spread, and with it the old legend resurfaced in the murmurs of the elderly, that the silent bell was not meant to call the faithful to prayer, but to summon them elsewhere, to a gathering not of this earth, and that once in every few centuries it would toll in a voice only the other side could hear, claiming those marked by its resonance. Father Gregorio refused every question, ordered the church sealed, and told the sexton that he must speak with higher authorities before anyone entered again. Yet that night, when the square was empty and the frost silvered the cobblestones, a widow named Serafina, who lived in a windowed loft opposite the belfry, claimed she saw movement high in the tower, the silhouette of the priest standing close to the bell, not pulling the rope, but tilt, inclines his head as though listening to some murmur deep within the bronze, his hands resting lightly on its rim as though in conversation. And though she could hear no sound, she felt, in her chest, the faint echo of a heartbeat that was not her own, a steady pulse in the air that made her close the shutters and pray until morning. By the time the pale January sun struggled up over Montevideo frost-rimed rooftops, the town was no longer a place of quiet piety, but of fractured whispers and darting glances. Its narrow, cobbled streets nearly deserted, save for the few who shuffled past with collars drawn high and eyes fixed to the ground, as though meeting another's gaze might tempt fate into noticing them. For every household now carried the same hollow fear, that the strange silence which had devoured the 32 might return to claim more. And yet, while many huddled indoors, a corps of determined townsmen gathered outside the barred oak doors of San Lorenzo, stamping their boots against the cold and speaking in low, tense bursts. Among them stood farmers with calloused hands still dusted in soil from the fields, merchants in patched winter coats smelling faintly of dried figs and grain, and at their head Captain Alessio Rinaldi, an aging but broad-shouldered man whose once black hair had gone to silver during his years of service in the Papal Guard, his eyes sharp and searching beneath heavy brows, the sort of man who had led others into danger without hesitation, and now found himself drawn to confront this mystery as if it were an enemy force. The men called for Father Gregorio to open the church, their voices echoing off the empty facades. And after a long interval, the priest appeared in the shadow of the great doorway, his cassock hanging looser than before, his face a shade paler than the snow clinging to the eaves above, his fingers wrapped so tightly around the iron keyring that the knuckles stood out like carved bone. He refused them at first, mumbling about waiting for guidance and matters beyond mortal authority. But as the crowd swelled and the muted, Raimurs sharpened into threats of forcing the lock. He relented, turning the key with a reluctant metallic groan that seemed to carry far more weight than the movement of iron on iron. And as the doors swung open, the interior lay before them exactly as it had been left the previous morning. Shawls still draped over pews, candles burnt to uneven stubs, a scattering of hymnals resting open as though their owners had stepped away mid-verse, the air colder even than the frost outside, and laced with that faint metallic tang that had haunted those who'd been present during the vanishing. Rinaldi took the lead, striding up the central aisle with two men carrying lanterns, his boots ringing softly on the stone floor, scanning each shadow with the careful precision of a soldier advancing into uncertain ground. They searched the altar first, then the small sacristy behind it where vestments hung in tidy rows, their folds stiff in the chill, and from there they descended into the crypt, where the low ceiling forced them to duck, and the damp stones exhaled the smell of centuries-old decay. Yet nothing stirred in the torchlight except for the sluggish drip of water from the joints between flagstones. It was in the cramped vestry, a narrow room lined with drawers and shelves of parish records, that a discovery was made by Paolo Conti, a merchant of olive oil and wine who had once served as the parish clerk. There, tucked behind a stack of disused missiles, lay a leather-bound ledger so ancient that the touch of a finger caused its cover to flake into soft brown dust. Its pages foxed and brittle, but filled from first to last with columns of names written in an ink so faded that the lantern's glow had to be tilted just right to reveal them. The handwriting was a cramped, archaic scrawl with looping descenders and peculiar hooked ascenders. And, though the dates beside the names marched back, quarred into history, the earliest entry bore the year 1311, the same year the silent bell had been forged, while the most recent page contained 32 names written in fresher ink, each accompanied by the date of the feast of St. Felix just past, and every single one belonged to a parishioner who had vanished. Yet there was something else. Beside each date lay a small sigil, an inverted chalice formed of 3 strokes, strange and unsettling in its simplicity, repeated unbroken through centuries of entries, though the intervals between dates varied wildly, sometimes decades apart, sometimes separated by only a few years, suggesting a pattern that was less regular than it was deliberate. The implication pressed into the minds of the men like the slow weight of a millstone. This was not an accident, nor the first time, but part of a record kept meticulously for nearly 500 years, its completion as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. When confronted, Father Gregorio's composure cracked visibly. His lips trembled. His eyes flicked again and again toward the belfry, as if expecting a sound to drop from it at any moment, and his hands twitched toward the crucifix at his breast before falling away, as though uncertain whether it could shield him. In a voice that shook between defiance and defeat, he admitted that he had inherited the ledger from his predecessor, Father Bellini, along with a sealed letter marked with wax impressed by a sigil identical to the one in the book, which he had been instructed never to open unless the silence returned. And though he claimed to have resisted his curiosity for years, Gregorio described how Bellini, in a rare moment of wine-loosened speech, had once confessed that the silent bell had been cast not merely as a call to worship, but as a vessel of covenant, its bronze infused with a fragment of an older relic, unearthed from the foundations of a pagan temple that had crowned the hill before the first church was raised, an offering bowl used in rites to a god of thresholds, one who stood between realms and demanded passes. Age tolls not in coin, but in living souls. Struck in a certain way, the bell's tone would be inaudible to human ears, yet heard beyond the veil, summoning whatever lay there, and those whose lives had been marked by that vibration would be claimed in answer to some ancient pact. Gregorio swore he had dismissed the story as drunken folly until the previous day, but now believed every word. Desperate to recover their loved ones, the villagers organized search parties that scoured the surrounding forests, combed through caves, and descended into the abandoned marble quarries whose stone had built half the town. But every trail ended the same way, with no sign, no footprint, no sound, until it was as if the vanished had stepped cleanly into the air. That night, Captain Rinaldi insisted on a watch over the church, stationing lantern-bearing men at each door and setting himself to patrol the nave, his presence a bulwark against the dread that seemed to seep from the stones themselves. But as midnight approached, a thick, slow-moving mist began to coil upward from the ground around the belfry, though the rest of Montevideo lay clear beneath a brittle scatter of stars. Those watching swore they saw shapes moving within it. Tall, robed figures whose faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, bearing between them something heavy and indistinct toward the uppermost arch where the bell hung. Rinaldi, clutching his lantern and calling for 2 men to follow, mounted the narrow spiral stair within the tower, his boots striking the worn stone steps in a steady rhythm. But before long, the climb seemed to lengthen unnaturally, each curve of the stair revealing only more of the same, and the walls pressing in with a damp chill, until the men's breathing grew labored, and their ears filled with a faint, bone-deep vibration like the murmur of a voice speaking too low to understand, when at last the A emerged into the bell chamber. The mist was gone. The great bronze hung silent and motionless in its cradle, and yet the flagstones underfoot were wet with something darker than water pooling, briefly before seeping away into the hairline cracks, leaving no stain. None of them spoke until they had descended again, but later, in the privacy of his home, Rinaldi confided to his wife that in the moment before he turned to leave the belfry, he had glimpsed the ledger, open on a wooden stool that had not been there before, its final page displaying his own name written in fresh black ink beneath the 32 others, the date beside it set for the feast of St. Agnes just 7 days away, and underlined twice as though to mark its certainty. He had tried to rip the page free, but found the parchment unyielding, the fibers resisting as though it were not paper at all, but part of the book's own flesh. By morning, Rinaldi was gone, last seen by a milk seller walking alone toward the church in the first light of dawn, and when Gregorio, pale as bleached bone, checked the ledger in the vestry, he found the captain's name exactly as described, except now the ink of the date had deepened to a reddish-brown, as though it had been written not with ink at all, but with something drawn warm from a living vein. The morning after Captain Rinaldi's disappearance dawned not with the clear blue promise of winter sun, but under a sky the color of tarnished pewter, the light filtering weak and cold over Montevideo, as though the day itself were reluctant to begin. And in that dimness the townsfolk moved about with a sluggish, watchful air, pausing often to glance toward the hill where the church of San Lorenzo loomed, its belfry a mute sentinel against the mist that clung stubbornly to the upper slopes. The knowledge that Rinaldi's name had been written into the accursed ledger, alongside the 32 already taken, spread through the town like the slow seep of ink through cloth, and with it came a grim certainty that whatever force governed the silent bell was not yet finished. Father Gregorio, who had scarcely slept since the feast of St. Felix, now appeared as if the very marrow had been leached from his bones, his eyes shadowed, his steps uneven, yet there was a purpose about him that none had seen before, for he had resolved at last to break the wax seal on the letter left by his predecessor, a letter that had weighed like a stone in his mind for years, locked away in the lowest drawer of the vestry cabinet. He carried it into the rectory study at first light, setting it on the desk beside a single candle whose thin flame wavered as though troubled by an unseen breath. And as he slid the small silver blade under the seal, the wax gave with a dry crack that seemed disproportionately loud in the silence. The letter within was written in a hand firmer and older than Bellini's, the ink brown and faintly iridescent in places, and it spoke not in parable or pastoral counsel, but in the stark tone of one delivering orders. When the toll is demanded, the keeper must ascend alone. He will hear no sound, yet it will be heard. The marked shall be gathered, and their release purchased by the keeper's surrender. Failure to climb before the first light shall see the toll claimed twice over. Beneath the words was the same inverted chalice sigil that had haunted the ledger, and for a long moment Gregorio sat staring at it, his breathing shallow, until the candle's guttering brought him back to himself. He understood then that the title keeper had passed from priest to priest along with the key to the belfry and the ledger's unbroken record, and that the role demanded not merely the tending of the flock, but, when the silence came, the offering of one's own life to spare them. An inheritance he had never asked for, but could no longer refuse. That evening, he called together the remaining elders of Montevelio in the rectory hall, their faces lined with a mixtu of fear and incredulity as he explained, in the plainest terms, what the letter required. Some urged him to flee, to ride hard for Bologna and never look back, while others, their grief sharpened into desperation, begged him to do as the letter commanded, believing that only thus could their loved ones be restored. Outside, a raw wind had risen, worrying at shutters and carrying with it a soundless pressure that made the inner ear ache, a reminder that the toll's hour was approaching. As the first thin line of dawn began to pale the eastern horizon, Gregorio wrapped himself in his thick wool cassock and began the slow ascent of the belfry's spiral stair, each step slick with the condensation of the mist that pressed in around the tower. From the square below, those who dared to watch saw his lantern's faint glow wind upward through the narrow windows, climbing higher until it vanished into the topmost chamber. There, within the bell-room, the air was colder than any winter wind, and the silent bell hung massive and unmoving, yet it seemed to breathe in the mist that pooled about its base, drawing it in with each unseen inhalation. Then the shapes began to form, first vague and formless, then resolving into the figures of the 32 lost parishioners, their skin pale as moonlit marble, their eyes pools of black glass reflecting no light, their expressions vacant, as if some essential thread had been snipped from within them. Behind them stood Captain Rinaldi, his face calm but unreadable, as though he had accepted some truth too vast to speak. They formed a silent ring around the bell, and from their number stepped a single taller figure, hooded and robed in a weave so dark it seemed to drink the dim light entirely, its hands long and thin, the skin stretched taut over bones that looked carved from ash. In one hand it carried a slender mallet of blackened bronze, which it held out toward Gregorio without a word. The priest understood without needing speech. He must take the mallet, strike the bell, and in so doing bind himself in place of the others, his fingad, rars, closed around the metal, its chill sinking instantly into his bones. And as he lifted it, the mist surged upward in a great spiral, wrapping around the bell in thickening coils. When he struck, no sound reached his ears, yet the vibration that rolled through the stones was deep enough to stir the marrow. And he saw, through the shifting veil, the parishioners turn and step backward into the mist, their forms dissolving into it as though into deep water. Last of all was Rinaldi, who met Gregorio's gaze and gave the smallest nod before vanishing into the whiteness. The hooded figure then reached out one pale hand and touched Gregorio's forehead, and in that instant the cold became absolute, seizing his limbs until he could no longer move. The mist pressed in thick and suffocating, and when it finally withdrew, the chamber was empty save for the great bell and the figure of the priest standing utterly still, eyes open but unseeing, his skin glazed with a thin rime of frost. At that same moment, down in the square, the 32 reappeared on the church steps in the very clothes they had worn on the day of their vanishing, bewildered but unharmed, their memories of the missing days erased as though by a merciful hand. Captain Rinaldi was not among them. The townsfolk rushed to embrace their returned kin, some weeping openly, others crossing themselves again and again, but when they looked up to the belfry they saw only a pale shape framed in the arch. Gregorio, motionless as a statue. By nightfall his body was gone from the tower, leaving only his cassock folded neatly on the stone where he had stood, and the silent bell hung as before, mute and inscrutable. The ledger in the vestry lay closed, the final page now bearing a single new name in fresh, dark ink. Gregorio di Montevelio, beneath which the date was left blank, as if the toll's final claim had been paid in full or deferred until some future feast when the silence might once again rise from the hill and the bell's toll, heard only beyond sound, would summon another keeper to climb those cold, winding steps.